Hello and welcome to my final video for Psychology 5011 Individual Testing, where I will overview a few points from each of the units. I'll start with talking about the APA ethics codes. This is important because the history of psychology is riddled with unethical things, and we're always trying to improve that. The APA has a set of ethics codes, but it didn't always. So the APA was founded in 1892. At the time, instead of having a set of ethics codes, if there was anything that was in question, a group would meet and discuss the situation and make case-by-case decisions. The first known ethics code applying to psychology was actually created not by the APA, but by the ACP, which is the Association of Consulting Psychologists, in 1933. By 1938, the APA established an ethics committee. So, still not codes, but just a committee that was in charge of that. At this time, there are also a few different groups in the realm of psychology. A lot of them ended up merging to become the APA. So in 1947, the National Vocational Guidance Association created an ethics code. Also, the APA Ethics Committee recommended the adoption of an ethics code. So they're seeing other people do it, and finally they decided to do it, and by 1953, the first code was published. It was revised in 1959, and it was again edited, and addendums were attached in 1981, 1992, 2003, 2010, and 2017. 2017 is the one that stands today. The APA ethics codes, there are many, and I definitely don't have time to go over all of them, but I want to talk about some of the general principles. Beneficence and non-maleficence means try to do good or at least do no harm. Doing unnecessary experiments on people just because you're curious, that would kind of go under that would not be ethical. Fidelity and responsibility. Who are you responsible to? What are you responsible for? If you're a clinician, you're responsible for your clients. If you are doing research, let's say, you're responsible for making sure that you're going to do things that will keep the public trusting psychology. Integrity, I feel like that kind of goes with integrity. And then justice, an example of injustice be, let's say you are doing a study for a drug on predominantly poor people, and the drug comes out and it's so expensive that only rich people can afford it. That would be considered unjust. The last one is respect for people's rights and dignity. An example of this is, let's say you're doing research. People have the right to informed consent. They have the right to know what they're getting into, and they also have the right to opt out. So that is part of respecting their rights. The APA ethics codes apply only to psychologists' activities that are part of their scientific, educational, or professional roles as psychologists. You can see these ethics codes in practice in the example of the myth that vaccines cause autism. In 1998, Wakefield and 13 co-authors published a study linking the MMR vaccine to autism. This article was later redacted, and 10 of the 13 co-authors acknowledged that the study was inaccurate. There have been thousands of studies since then that have essentially proven that that study was unfounded. The ethics codes involved would be 8.1, reporting research results. Psychologists do not fabricate data. If psychologists discover significant errors in their published data, they take responsible steps to correct it. In this study, it was later discovered that information was falsified. And the second one was conflict of interest. Psychologists refrain from taking on a professional role when personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interests or relationships could reasonably be expected to impair their objectivity or competence. So in this study, it ends up that the investigators specifically chose people to be in the study that they sort of knew were going to have certain results. They were clients that Wakefield was already working with. And the other ethical issue as far as conflict of interest is that the study was funded by lawyers acting for patients who were involved in a lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. So essentially, they're paying someone to come up with some reason why the vaccines are dangerous, the institution or persons funding your research, if they have something to gain from that research, even if you are not consciously trying to find a result that will benefit them, you still, even unconsciously, that's what you're looking for. The reason why I found this so interesting is that so many parents today refuse to vaccinate their children, and this just shows how dangerous misinformation can be, because it was redacted years ago, but it was too late. It's like the people had heard it, they got it in their head, that's what it is. And even though, if you look at how many studies show there is no link to the one study that says that there is a link and then it was redacted, if you understand how research works and you know how to look into something, you can easily see, oh, it's not true. But most people will just go with what they hear. So that's why these ethical guidelines are in place. The last one from Unit 1, I decided to talk about HIPAA. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. This act was created for protection for the privacy of individually identifiable health information. What is individually identifiable health information? That can either be a person's past, present, or future physical or mental health condition, the provision of health care to the individual, or the past, present, or future payment for the provision of health care to the individual. The purpose of the act was to protect information from just anyone getting it, basically. And there are certain covered entities that are required to follow these rules. A covered entity includes a health plan, a healthcare clearinghouse, a healthcare provider. As someone in the field of psychology, HIPAA could affect you. And an example of that would be if you are a psychologist and you're involved in a study like a drug trial, then you're going to be dealing with people's personal medical information. And that means that there are laws saying how that information can be used, and you have to be aware of those in order to perform your study ethically without violating the rights of the participants. Unit 2, the Daubert Standard. It has to do with expert witnesses in a trial presenting evidence. And before this standard was put into place, the quote-unquote general acceptance rule was used, which was very vague. So if, let's say, a psychologist were to take the stand and give an opinion, if it seemed that most psychologists would agree with it, they went with, okay, yeah, that sounds right. However, after Daubert versus Morel Dow Pharmaceuticals, the Daubert standard was put into place, and this requires that evidence was derived from methodology that has or can be tested empirically, has been subjected to peer review and publication, has a known or documented potential rate of error, and has achieved general acceptance in its relevant scientific community. It still works within general acceptance, but it lays out specific things that would make it generally accepted. These are the requirements that still exist today. So if you were to go into forensic psychology, this would be something that you would need to be aware of. There's still speculation that this is maybe not as effective as it could be. Often, when an expert witness testifies, it seems that just the fact that they have a degree and that they're testifying means that you should believe what they say. But of course, not all psychologists are going to agree, and nothing is ever black and white. So having these rules laid out help. However, one of the concerns that some people have is that this puts the bulk of responsibility on judges. So yes, there's this rule, but judges may not be aware of the current methodology and statistics that goes into psychology, So in the future, it's possible there could be something that is a little bit better. But for now, this would be something that you would need to be aware of if you go into forensic psychology. The second thing that I chose to focus on for Unit 2 is mental status exam. A mental status exam is a very general term for a loosely structured interview that is like a psychological version of a yearly physical exam. The purpose is to provide an accurate description of a person's functioning. And the MSSE can be part of this, and I'm going to be talking about the MSSE in one of the next units if you are a clinician in a variety of contexts, but let's say someone comes in for personal one-on-one therapy. Some of the things that you want to be looking at are appearance and behavior. You're looking at grooming. Why grooming? Are they taking care of themselves? There are certain psychiatric disorders whose symptoms will manifest in people not caring about their grooming or not being able to do it. Sometimes depression or schizophrenia. And then eye contact. For example, if you're doing an autism spectrum disorder assessment, there may be minimal eye contact. Gross motor behavior. The person could have obsessive movements or tics, which could be a sign of OCD or other disorders. Speech and communication processes. Speech content, what are they talking about? Are they focusing on delusion, or are they talking about things that are just very relevant? Rate, tone, and volume. Are they talking really fast, which could possibly be a sign of mania? Or if we go back to like an ASD evaluation, you might often see someone with ASD have either very high or very low volume of voice, or often they might be monotone. Are they having difficulty with words, which could cause confusion? Are they misusing words? This could be a sign of dementia. And all of these things that I've talked about so far, this isn't like we're diagnosing based on this. You're just looking for these signs because then you add that to your bank of everything else you know about this person, and it gives you an idea of what to possibly look into or continue to evaluate. So I'm being very general here. Cognitive and memory function. Are they able to immediately recall things? In the MSSE, that's something that's tested, which we'll talk about later. How well is their recent and remote memory, their fund of information and abstracting ability? Are they able to think through things clearly? Emotional function. What is their predominant mood? Do they seem depressed? Do they seem manic? Do they seem melancholic? Appropriateness of affect. An example of something that would be an inappropriate affect might be someone laughing in a sad situation, and that can be a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. Insight and judgment. Are they aware of their problems? There are some types of disorders where people are easily very aware, and there are some where they are not, or they don't see it as a problem. For example, someone who is narcissistic or in some cases borderline personality disorder tend to seek out help less or see their challenges as less of a problem. Orientation. Are they oriented to the day, date, time, and location? So this would give you an idea of their level of awareness, which could be connected to whether or not they're having a psychotic episode, or again, if there are possible dementia issues. These are just some things you would want to look at when you are having a conversation with them. You're getting some general information, but as you're getting general information, you are also paying attention to these things because this could help you decide what needs to be assessed or what kind of help that person needs. The last one for Unit 2 is the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR. The Psychopathy Checklist was created by Robert Hare, and it's a checklist that assesses psychopathic traits. It was originally used in research, but was later used in the criminal justice system. This checklist has been used in quite a few different studies. Some examples would be associating recidivism with the PCLR, as well as specifically recidivism of sex offenders and violent recidivism in general. And it has been found to be generalizable across cultures and countries. So in many ways, this checklist has been very helpful. The checklist is broken down into 2 factors and 4 facets. Factor 1 is interpersonal affective traits, so things like cunning manipulation and grandiosity, and callousness and shallow affect. Factor 2 is lifestyle traits, like irresponsibility and impulsivity, as well as antisocial traits from childhood through adulthood. So this checklist has been found, like I said, to be very beneficial in identifying possibility of recidivism and used in other ways in research. However, just like all the assessments and tools that we have, it is just one tool. So the creator was a little bit concerned when it started being used in the criminal justice system because it's not as simple as if someone scores on this checklist, they are a psychopath. And the concern there is that someone's fate could quickly be decided. We don't want to just lock someone up based on a checklist, but this is one tool that can be used with many other tools to help people make decisions. Unit 3, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. I chose the MMPI as one of the things to talk about because I think it's so fascinating how common this is in so many different places. I had heard of this before I ever went into psychology. It was published in 1943, and it's a personality inventory designed to aid in diagnosis. That was originally what it was designed for. So they created clinical scales based on comparing item responses from a participant group with clinical diagnoses to responses from a control group. It ended up being used a little bit less for that, I feel like, but that's what it was originally intended for. It is the most widely used personality test in the US. In 1989, the MMPI-2 was published, with scales based on new norms with larger and more diverse samples of participants, which is good because back in 1943, most of the people used in studies, I would say, were homogeneous groups. It includes many scales, including validity scales, which is good because that can protect the test against things like people trying to fake good or fake bad or respond in ways that would not be authentic. It has positive reliability, internal consistencies ranging from 0.3 to 0.7, test-retest ranges from 0.5 to 0.9. That does seem like quite a range, but a lot of different studies have been done on it. Validity for one analysis was 0.46, which isn't great, but I actually couldn't find a lot of studies that were specifically looking at the validity and reliability of this test, but there are so many studies that use this test to predict other things. So thousands of studies have used the MMPI in many different ways, ranging from childhood trauma to predicting who will have tattoos. So there's just all sorts of different things. It was used for predicting recidivism in prison populations. And another thing it's been used for is selection for employment. I believe it's also been used for things like to try to let people know what career they should be in. So this is a very widely used test. I would say by now it's been used in enough studies to know that there is some validity to it. However, it should always be taken with more information than just that one test. Next in Unit 3, Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler was born in 1870, and in 1895 he earned his medical degree from the University of Vienna. In 1907, he met Sigmund Freud. So he wasn't originally a psychologist, but he ended up getting interested in psychology, and Freud and Adler formed the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. In 1911, Adler broke from Freud and his theories. Freud was sort of known for meeting with people and they like him because they think their ideas are great. And then at one point they disagree on something and there's a disconnection. So it seemed that he kind of felt like it was his way or the highway as far as theories go. He focused on the importance of the social realm, which is, I think, one of the main things that him and Freud disagreed with. In 1912, he founded the Society of Individual Psychology, and immigrated to the United States, and in 1937 he died of a heart attack. So he actually didn't live very long. It's pretty impressive for the short period of time that he lived, the impact that he had on psychology. He argued for a holistic view of the individual. He believed that the social realm is equally as important to psychology as the internal realm of the individual. And this is something that not a lot of people were focusing on that in his time. He focused greatly on family dynamics, specifically parenting and family constellation, as a preventative means of addressing possible future psychological problems. Nowadays, we have a lot of studies about how important having a social support system is for supporting mental health. So he was one of the first to really focus on that. Adlerian psychotherapists have no specific technique. And he said, in order to understand a person's future, we must understand his style of life. So he had this theory that everyone has a style of life or sort of a way they go about doing things. And if you understand that, you can understand that person. And so because he had the style of life he focused on and social interest he focused on, that's one of the reasons why Adlerian psychotherapists have no specific technique, because it was such a holistic view. And he was so influential that there was actually a university called Adler University that sort of bases their whole way that they teach around his ideas, which is fascinating. Last of Unit 3, I chose the Sub-Threshold Autism Trait Questionnaire, or the SATQ. The reason why I chose this is because I was researching different assessments for autism, and most of the assessments listed in textbooks that I looked at were, first of all, focused on children. So I wanted to look into what are ones they use on adults. And this one is actually relatively new. It was created in 2012, but looks like it can be a really good tool for assessing autism. So it was created by Kane et al. In 2012, and it demonstrated convergent validity with other measures that have been used to assess ASD traits, such as the Autism Spectrum Quotient and the Broader Autism Phenotype Questionnaire. So these are two common ones that have been used. Empirical support for the SATQ, capturing more information than the AQ. So the AQ was actually designed for assessing Asperger's syndrome, which is no longer listed as a separate syndrome in the DSM. It's included under autism. So this is then helpful because it is effective like the AQ, but it actually captures some things that the AQ doesn't even look at because it was focusing on Asperger's. It has good internal consistency and reliability, with Cronbach's alpha coefficient of 0.73 and test-retest reliability of 0.79, which is good. It was subjected to factor analysis and identified 5 subdomains: social interaction and enjoyment, oddness, reading facial expressions, expressive language, and rigidity. One of the studies that I looked at that analyzed the SATQ, this study looked at about 5 different assessments for autism, and they recommended the SATQ in terms of classical test theory due to its short length and its effectiveness. Moving on to Unit 4, the first thing I chose to talk about for Unit 4 is the NEO Personality Inventory. The NEO Personality Inventory was created in 1978 by Costa and McRae. They developed it originally only including neuroticism, extroversion, and openness. Later, in 1987, they revised it to include agreeableness and conscientiousness. This is a personality assessment that is based on the Big Five, or the 5-factor model of personality. This model of personality is widely used and considered the most empirically based type of personality assessment. It's been proven to have a high degree of power in predicting behavior, and it's based on factor analysis. The idea of using factor analysis to create assessments like this was sort of a big step towards making something like a personality assessment more empirically based, which in a way can be a little bit difficult because some of the concepts that have to do with personality are sometimes hard to operationalize. There are 3 versions, including self-report and observation report. The internal consistency of the NEO-PIR test ranges from 0.56 to 0.96, which is a bit of a range, but pretty good. Validity is backed by substantial evidence. It does not, however, include validity scales like the MMPI does. It's assuming that the participant is being honest in the self-report or whoever is observing the person. The test has been shown to be useful in such areas as clinical psychology, education, and research. Next in Unit 4, the Rorschach inkblot test. The Rorschach inkblot test is probably one of the most widely known tests outside of psychology, which I am not basing on any facts other than my own observation. I feel like it's shown a lot in media. The description of this test is that it's a projective test of personality functioning based on interpreting a person's responses to 10 bilaterally symmetrical inkblots. The person looks at the inkblot and they're asked what they think it is, and based on how they respond, you can assume certain things about that person. Data can provide information on variables such as motivations, response tendencies, cognitive operations, affectivity, and personal and interpersonal perceptions. There have been over 200 books and 10,000 articles that have been written about this test. Rorschach's description of his test is that the process by which persons organize their responses to the Rorschach is representative of how they confront other ambiguous situations requiring organization and judgment. It was created in 1921, and originally it included 10 cards. After Rorschach died in 1941, the way that the test was administered started to vary greatly because there was not one person who was saying this is how you should do the test. And so different people started creating different ways of interpreting the inkblots and different inkblots that they were using. So Exner and his colleagues began the collection of a broad normative database and development of an integrated system for scoring the interpretation. This was an attempt to make it more organized and make it so that the test was being used the same way each time and that it was actually based on norms. In 1974, the Rorschach, a comprehensive system, was published by Exner and his colleagues. In 2006, Exner died. Researchers later published the Rorschach Performance Assessment System, or the RPAS, and that included 450 contemporary protocols, norms from ages 18 to over 65, evenly divided between genders with a wide range of education and a variety of ethnic groups. This is important because this is a projective test. A projective test can be difficult in that it's a little bit more difficult to make it empirical and to show how well it works if different people are taking different interpretations off of other people's answers. When you start including norms of large and diverse groups, then you have more evidence to back up interpretations. The last slide I'm going to talk about here is the Mini Mental State Examination, or the MSSE. The MSSE was developed in the 1970s by Fulstein et al., and it quickly became used more than any other exam when it comes to cognitive impairments. One of the reasons why it became so widely used is because it's so easy to use. It takes a very small amount of time. So 5 to 10 minutes to perform it. It can be used in many different situations. It's primarily used to screen for delirium or dementia. It can also be used if dementia has progressed. It should not be used for mild cognitive impairments, aphasia, or frontal lobe disorders. So this picture here is an example of part of the MSSE. A good example of when this might be used is, let's say you have someone who's aging, they're in a long-term care facility, and periodically the clinician wants to check in and see how their cognitive function is doing. They can do this quickly, once a week or once a day, and see whether or not the dementia is progressing or whether or not dementia exists. So some of the things that they ask are, what year is it? What season is it? What day of month? So you're looking at, are they oriented to where they are? Do they know what time it is? And then as far as recall, you list off 3 things. You ask them to remember it. You ask them a few other things. You go back to it. The average person who does not have dementia would very easily be able to remember 3 things after a few minutes. However, people suffering from dementia are going to have a hard time with that. There's a little bit of calculation. You can have them spell words backwards or have them add up something simple. There are a few different versions of this test. And then you have them repeat, no ifs, ands, or buts. Sometimes giving simple direction can even be difficult for them to do. And on the bottom here, you can see that there's a design and they have to copy the design. So often they will have difficulty drawing simple shapes or recognizing that the shapes that they drew are different from the shapes that they're looking at. This is a very effective test and it's easy to administer. That wraps up all my slides. I'm going to move on to my resources and leave each page there for just a few minutes so that you can look at them.